Um, the next major figure, not necessarily like historically or chronologically, but the next major figure in terms of these arguments, right? These types of arguments, um, is St. Thomas Aquinas, right? And he's the next major figure because he is perhaps the one who is provided most of the most arguments, cosmological arguments for God's existence amongst all the various monks and Christian philosophers. He provided so many. He's notable for 5 particular proofs for God's existence, but he provided well over 30 individual proofs. Sorry, including including a lot that are most of the ones that he used, especially these 5 in particular, are still used by the church today, the Catholic Church. And also you hear them being in various forms, the most commonly espoused ones by, you know, the average Christian in one form or another. Like I said, the cosmological argument's the most populous one and the most common form of arguing for God's existence, and it's the most common one in the Judeo-Christian religion. A good chunk of that can be laid at Aquinas's feet because he provided so many different versions of it. So, a quick bit about Aquinas. He always wanted to be a monk from the time he was very young, like 3 or 4. His parents, however, not so big fans on that idea, because he came from like minor nobility, essentially. And as the only heir of minor nobility, he was expected to carry on the line, marry someone of slightly higher standings, daughter, in order to, expand the family wealth. Typical rich person junk, or just typical classism. His family were so not impressed by this idea that when he threatened to run away as soon as he was old enough to join, I think it was the Benedictine order of the monks, so age 14 he would have had to been. His parents, his mother and father imprisoned him in a tower. He was like essentially a real life Rapunzel, only he weighed about 300 pounds, based off of what we know. So, like, very rotund fellow. He was a real life Rapunzel. Like, his parents imprisoned him for 2 years, right? And his father even tried to, even paid off prostitutes on multiple occasions and threw them into his room in the tower to try and, you know, have his son lose his virginity, since the Benedictine order would not accept, non-chaste members. So literally paid sex workers to try and, prevent his kid from fulfilling his dream. And that's got to be one of the craziest stories you'll ever hear, but it's true. However, with the help of some of his friends, Aquinas did escape his towery imprisonment and ran off to Calais, to become a monk. and he studied under Albertus Magnus, who was one of the chief translators of Aristotle at the time. And so he learned what wound up happening is Aquinas wound up learning a lot about Aristotle, and he had a deep, deep respect for Aristotle. In his works, he calls Aristotle the philosopher. Right? That's the title that he gives him. And I forget who was it. I think it was Ibn Ghazuli. So in his works, Aquinas usually would defend his position by citing three people. He would cite Christ through some biblical verse of the New Testament. He would cite, I want to say it was Ibn Ghazuli, but I could be wrong on that. Let me see. It's been a while since I thought about that. Forget it. So there was one of the things is a lot of Greek philosophy was preserved through Islamic and Arabic scholars after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire to about the time of Anselm. Right? It was Islamic scholars who helped preserve it. And one in particular, Ibn Rushd or Ibn Ghazuli, one of the two, was a noted Aristotelian because he preserved and translated Aristotle's works from Greek into Arabic and back into Latin, and then into Latin. And it's those Latin translations that Aquinas was most familiar with. And he calls this person, he called that Arabic philosopher the scholar. So Aristotle is the philosopher. Ibn Rushd or Ibn Ghazuli was the scholar, and then the savior is the title he gives Christ. And so his defense would go, here is something that Christ said, here is something that Aristotle said, here is something that Ibn Ghazuli or Ibn Rushd said that connects the two. Right? So he provided an Aristotelian interpretation and veneer to Christianity that's still there in a lot of the defenses. Right? Two of the chief concepts from Aristotle's metaphysics, or one chief concept rather, from Aristotle's metaphysics that he translated to Christianity was Aristotle's notion of the prima mobile, or the first mover, which, is the original cause of everything. Something that Aristotle never quite pins down in his own metaphysics, but which Aquinas attributes attributes to God, right? So God being the first mover, the creator, is a very central aspect of Aquinas's philosophy and his theology, and also his contributions to Christian theology as a whole. Right? It's not that that wasn't there prior to Aquinas, but he gave it, through all his various proofs, he gave such solidity to this idea that it became a central feature of Christian thought. God as the first mover, or as the prime mover. So, that huge tangent aside, the cosmological argument. Of the 5 proofs that we'll go over from Aquinas, 4 of them are versions of the cosmological argument, and 1 is a version of the teleological argument. So the first proof of the 5 is the proof from motion. Right? And this goes right back to Aristotle. There's potentiality and there's actuality. And we can frame this in terms of motion, right? There's potential motion and actual motion. So potential motion is something at rest that can be moved. And then there's actual motion, something that is moving. The universe and the heavens are in a state of constant motion, right? But they had to have been at some point just merely potential motion. So something had to have set the universe into motion, and he attributes this to God. It's essentially sort of an argument for the domino effect as a form of proof, right? There had to have been a first cause to all the motion that we see in the universe. And that first cause had to have stood outside of it, just the same way that the person who sets up the dominoes, or the person that, all the dominoes in a setup don't just fall by themselves. There's something that causes the first one to fall, and it stands outside the chain of dominoes. Right? And that's what God functionally was. He, for Aquinas, he was the prime mover. Right? He tipped that first domino and started the sequence of events. That one's very straightforward, but you can see Aristotle's influence nonetheless. Right? The second one is the proof from efficient cause. Right? And again, right in the title, you can see Aristotle's influence, efficient cause. Isn't that one of Aristotle's 4 causes? Yes, it is. So every act has a cause, right? Or everything has something that plays upon it to cause it to change. And we can just more generally say that every effect has a cause, right? So if every effect has a cause, how do we stop in the infinite regress that would result, right? So if every effect has a cause that precedes it, there must be something in order to avoid an infinite regress. There must be something that is an effect, or that is a cause, but has no cause itself, that stands outside the chain of events. Again, the dominoes, right? And that's what God is. He is the uncaused cause. Right? So he created the first cause because he stands outside that sequence of events as eternal. He always has been and always will be, whereas everything else in existence is temporally constrained. It reflects in time, in space. But God doesn't, which is what allows him to be the uncaused cause, the thing that sets everything else into motion. I'll grant you it sounds very similar to the proof from motion. That's because they depend on the same sort of argumentation. But the proof from motion is more specifically meant to be geared towards the motion of the heavenly bodies, right? Of the celestial bodies. So the moon, the sun, the other planets, and the stars, right? Everything in the heavens being in motion. Whereas the proof from efficient cause is meant to be an argument for God as the very source of cause and effect to begin with. So when you get into the more nuance, the deeper nuances of them, they are different proofs, but they do rest on very similar argumentation. So the third proof is the proof from contingency. And contingency is just another way of saying possibility. Right? If something is possible, it may or may not be. Right? But everything that is in the universe is contingent. Right? It's possible that you didn't come to class today, or that I wasn't born, or that I decided not to become a philosophy professor, in which case you'd have a different person doing this lecture, or that you decide not to take decided to take a different class, or that any of us were even born. It's all just a matter of possibility. It could have happened some other way, such that that the present situation wasn't the case. Any number of things. And everything that exists in our universe is contingent, or so Aquinas argues. Right? And therefore, the universe itself, if all the parts that make up the universe are contingent, then the universe itself must be contingent, is what he argues. So, for this contingent universe, this universe that was merely a possibility to actually come into existence, there must have been something, once again, outside of it, that was not contingent, a necessary being, in the sense of in the ontological sense of necessity, right? Needed to cause its existence, i.e., God. And that's basically what the third proof is. Now, this one does commit a rather straightforward fallacy in the thinking, logical fallacy, known as the fallacy of composition, where you assume what is true of the parts is true of the whole. A very simple way of explaining this fallacy is saying that, okay, so the parts that make up a clock or a watch do not tell time. Therefore, a watch does not display the time. Right? That's very simple. Right? It's true of the parts, therefore it's true of the whole. But that sort of thinking is flawed because the whole does actually display time. The same thing's going on here. By arguing that the universe is contingent, or that everything in the universe is contingent, and therefore the universe itself must be contingent, it doesn't the argument that the whole thing is contingent doesn't necessarily follow from the fact that its parts are. Then the fourth and final cosmological proof is the proof from perfection. And this one's fairly different from the others. This one relies and connects, again, with Aristotle's notion of the soul, right? Aristotle's theory of the soul sort of creeps in here. For this proof, Aquinas says that things exist in an order of perfection, from a least perfect thing to a most perfect thing. That most perfect thing being God. So as the most perfect thing, God must exist at the opposite end of the spectrum from the least perfect thing. All right. And so what we have is things that merely exist all the way to things that have perfect existence, or the thing that has perfect existence, God. So stones merely exist. They don't have a soul. They're incapable of growth, reproduction. They don't have life, right? But they still exist. They have existence, right? And then we have plants, which grow and reproduce. They're alive. And even greater than plants, we have animals. They grow, they reproduce, they perceive, they desire, and they move. Right? They're capable of all these things, all these various powers, more powers, because they've got better souls. And then we have people next, right? Which do all the things that animals do, plus we reason. And then after that, after humans, we have God, who, according to this argument, has all the things and is capable of all the things that humans are capable of, but being the most perfect being in existence, he doesn't have the flawed reasoning or the flawed perception, the limited perception that humans do. He has that universal perception. He is all-knowing, right? And all-seeing. Right? Two common refrains. All right? Now, clearly there's two sort of straightforward problems with this proof. The first being it's kind of subjective, right? Because perfection, the Latin term perfectere, which is where the modern English comes from, was a naturally, it was an inherently comparative term, right? It's meant to say greater than. It's basically the Latin equivalent of saying greater, right? Something is greater. So it's all a matter of how you're comparing something. If you're comparing something based off of complexity, then yeah, if you're going in the order that the more complex a thing is, the greater it is, then God is the most perfect thing. But if you're saying that less complexity makes something greater, then the stone would be the greatest thing. So it's naturally subjective based off of how you're tilting the comparison. And this allows you to sort of move things around that line of that order of perfection any which way, so long as like God remains to one side of it, to one side of everything. And then secondly, the second objection is assuming it's not subjective, what if we classify things incorrectly, right? What if it's a decreasing order of imperfection instead of an increasing order of perfection? And if it's a decreasing order of imperfection, then, well, that sort of changes the whole system needed for the proof. Because then you're working, you have to change the definition of God to fit with the proof.